let's see. Okay, so we talked about some of this stuff about concepts, and let's see. I think I discussed this with you, but as I go through different concepts, I keep finding they'll come down to the same thing, like, you know, intensity, a kind of measurement of whatever it is, you know, like an extreme end of a standard being used. But a lot of them, like importance, intensity, I don't know what else. There's probably a few more examples. Importance, intensity, significance. They're like all kinds of measurements. So there's those categories that you keep getting the same category over and over again.
Yeah, it always goes to that point. It goes there eventually over everything,
Right.
every concept. I mean, in some way, that's what you would expect.
The concept, what about a concept that is something viewed from a certain perspective? I've seen this a few times. One example would be, this is from Opa, nature in turn denotes existence viewed from a certain perspective. Nature is existence regarded as a system of interconnected entities governed by law. But it is always like, what does it mean when a concept is something viewed from a certain perspective? Like, is that even a definition?
I think it could be a definition. I think
Okay.
if we worked it out, it'd be something related to consciousness, but it doesn't seem just as simple as a type of consciousness, or it's like a relationship between consciousness and existence, not just identifying distinct things, but the
Right.
relationship between them. So it seemed like a
Okay.
relationship between awareness and existence, and you would somehow get perspective out of that, I think. And from perspective, you've got different types of perspective. One being nature, maybe is a perspective, or objectivity could be a perspective, or subjectivity could be a perspective. Because I mean,
Couldn't
the
you?
value is. Say your question.
Yeah, go on. I'll tell you. I'll ask after.
No, I think the question would help me answer you better.
Couldn't you say the same thing about any concept though? Man is an entity viewed from a certain perspective. Like, but that's not.
I mean, you're explicitly saying you want to view it as viewed from. So you're trying to identify an aspect of awareness specifically. I mean, you're saying something is aware of things in this way. That's what
Yeah.
makes it a perspective. So but it's not just the awareness, but actually the status of reality even is part of that. The way you see reality specifically, not just the way you see, but the way you see reality. That's why I'm saying it's more of a relationship between consciousness and existence, and you could derive it from there. So I mean, that would be the value of making it genus differential, but also definition, because you're pointing out that it's a matter of um, a way of looking at reality from consciousness, and that it has to do with how you view facts and even epistemology, even. But we were just trying to take it down from seeing what it tries to identify, what it does refer to. I mean, clearly, when you say perspective, you're trying to say something about the way you see things. It can't have a perspective from a thing that has no perspective.
Yeah.
Perspectiveless would make no sense in terms of consciousness.
Right. You could say the same about causality though, right? Like cause and effect is our actions viewed from a certain perspective, but that's still
I would
maybe this.
disagree.
Okay.
I wouldn't say they're viewed from a specific perspective. I mean, yes, the concept is derived from a specific perspective, but the causality itself is not an aspect of your consciousness or your awareness. It's not caused by the relationship. I mean, the relation it's independent of any awareness you might have or might not have. I mean,
Okay.
that a ball rolls is not, of course, not dependent on your perspective. That's what I'm saying. So it's not just a perspective. You're identifying a fact about reality that exists apart from any perspective you might have.
But
If
isn't
you have
that the
no
same as
perspective,
nature here? Isn't that exactly the same? System of
nature,
interconnected entities governed by law.
it would seem like you're. I'm not sure I like that definition that they have here, but I would say, I mean, nature is a systematic perspective on the relationship between existence. It is about how you look at it, not, I mean, maybe you wouldn't want to call this a perspective. I also rather say nature is a form of causality
Okay.
rather than, I'm not sure why they have to say nature is a type of perspective. I wouldn't classify it as a type of perspective. And when I think perspective, I think like objectivity or subjectivism or disinterest or selfishness or things like that.
Okay. I'm still not clear on it, but it's a not a significant. I don't think it's a significant point, so we can go on and I'll come back to it later.
Yeah.
I worked on a condition. Would you agree with me that a condition is a kind of cause? Like if you want to define what condition is, it's a kind of cause and that creates some specified effect. What? Before I
It's
go on,
not,
I'll just.
well, let's think, say a condition of boiling water is that it's, or of water boiling is that it reaches 100 degrees Celsius. But I
Yeah.
want to say that's itself as a cause, as much as identifying when the cause occurs or identifying when um, the status of something, whether the certain status creates a cause. Like I
So
think the
maybe
way that
it's
molecules move is what
that
causes it.
unnecessary to create some specified effect rather than that cause. A kind of causes that create some effect. So that would mean you could have boiling water and you could have boiling water. It doesn't mean, or you could have something at 100 degrees, but it doesn't mean it's going to boil whatever it is that's in there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, the reason I asked you was just because I wanted to ask, like, I was thinking about it, I'm like, well, what's a near relative, like that term of a near relative of something as abstract as a condition? Like,
We could have what's like a condition. Maybe
my
potential.
mind is a complete blank on that stuff.
Maybe
Like if I'm looking
potential.
for near relatives,
I
what?
don't like that phrase near relative. So I
Yeah,
mean, I just get related concepts. I mean, maybe
yeah,
potential is related because it doesn't mean the thing is causing something at the time, but a certain range of possibilities for the item. Or the condition could be like criteria that must be met for a cause to occur.
I
Something
would
like that.
I would say it's the same as condition then, but because
Yeah.
you could have like if you have a capacity for something and it's you could have a necessary but not sufficient
Yeah.
cause. So you could have, that's why I put in necessary, because you might have like 5 conditions and they're
Yeah.
all together they become the cause. But if there's
Yeah.
just one that's acting,
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
but
you could say it's boiling because it reached 100 degrees Celsius.
right,
Therefore, that caused the boiling. Yeah, I mean, I
right,
guess it depends on your level of abstraction, but that's right. You could call that a cause, but yeah, necessary
yeah,
seems the best way to put it.
but
Potential seems related, but clearly it's not always necessary for something to occur. Well, in a way, potential is a type of
yeah,
condition.
maybe it is a capacity or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that
uh,
could be a way to think of it. Potential would be
but
that there's a range of possibilities, so that might be similar.
yeah,
What I mean, conditions would be what determine which potential.
right, yeah, okay, maybe you're right. But anyway, near relative is, I always find I go blank on trying
Capacity
to,
might work. Just
yeah,
related concepts. Don't worry too much about near relative. I mean, if it pops up, sometimes it does. But I think similar concepts or related concepts might have capacity. Yeah, that's a good concept to think up here. Um, Causes. Let's see what else is related.
well, causes the genus of condition, because it's a condition is a kind of cause,
Yeah, you could say
but
yeah.
within a specified some kind of specific context.
Yeah. Yeah. We're expressing it to like specific entities or the nature of certain entities
Okay.
rather than just, yeah. That's how you would think about it. That would be the right way to think about it. Or that's how you would break it down and go from any analysis from there.
What do you think of my thoughts on inductive inference? The way you know you've reached a conclusion and that it's proven is that there's no reasonable alternatives to a hypothesis. So like you've got a hypothesis and you've proved it true. And then if there are no reasonable alternatives, well, no, there's evidence and you know the hypothesis is true, but and you can't think of reasonable alternatives, then you have proof. Like the whole idea of proof is that there's no alternatives. Would you say that's a good way to think about it? I came up with this after I read this thread about David saying like, how do you work out when someone is like how do you categorize someone morally? It's all about reasonable alternatives. And if someone kills someone, for example, like there's many possible motivations they could have other than they're evasive. And so it's only like the whole idea of a proof is reasonable alternatives being present.
And I would say just also that, and all evidence has been considered, or all known evidence has been considered. Not just that you use what you had and made a reasonable conclusion, but took the time. Because, I mean, if you took your first thought, it might be there's no reasonable conclusion, but I know I didn't use all the evidence yet. Like your initial thought on, like, say in the Compass story by Borges, like, one guy thought like, oh, it's probably a guy who broke in, and could say that's a no reasonable alternative, but he would know he didn't consider all the evidence yet. So why I say when you reach proof is when you've gone through all the evidence and sorted through evidence, then you could say, and then you can conclude if there is, what are the alternatives or what are reasonable possibilities. And you go through those, and then you could say, you have proof, I think. Because you don't want to say, what if I get more evidence? Well, proof has to do with the evidence you have. Right. Or you thinking you've gone through the evidence, found the evidence that you could, and there's also no more reasonable evidence to find, you could say.
I should probably read more detective stories, because now that I'm speaking about this, I'm like, it's too floating, because I can't, it's hard to connect to. You're always going through this process, right? I can see that on some implicit level, but it's actually really hard to, all right, well, how does that, I struggle to relate this to actual examples. So I'm just
medical mysteries and actual detective stories. Those are like the two best
medical
things.
mysteries.
Well, like House.
I'm not like into that. Anything medical.
Okay.
I would read Sherlock and detective stories.
Sherlock is people like that a lot, usually.
Yeah.
And Agatha Christie.
I've got that on my list too.
Yeah.
I asked a question about this actually, and someone answered, and I didn't realize this until recently, but I wanted to discuss it with you too. So generalization I used to think of as the almost always the equivalent of conceptualization, or like using concepts to form principles. That was under the concept of generalization, that was the only content. And then I realized after speaking to someone in some other group that association is a form of generalization, right? Like generalization is going from the particular to general. And so if you associate things by emotions, so if I'm like, I don't know, thunder, bad, sadness, what else would be thunder is bad and sadness, and then cars, bad and sad. Like that's a generalization. I've suddenly gone, from car to feeling sadness, from thunder to feeling sadness. And that's just a different form of generalization, right? It's not logical, but it still is one. Would you say that sort of makes sense?
I'm trying to think of my first thought when you said that though was like, say you associate I don't know, banana with monkey. Is that a generalization? Well, yeah, you're connecting two thoughts, but can we say it's been generalized? And I guess in one sense you are, because one concept is more particular than another. I mean, banana might be more particular than monkey, or than say chimpanzee, because chimpanzee is a specific species, and banana is a little broader than that. But I don't know if I really call that a process of generalization. You're taking one concept and going broader on that concept. You're just connecting two concepts, or even if they're not concepts, just two thoughts, you're connecting them. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a generalization. I mean, you could associate monkey with animal, and you could say that's a kind of association, but also a generalization. So if you associate things that way, it might be actually an integration rather than an association. But I think you're just
Okay.
associating things. Say monkey to banana, then I wouldn't really call that a generalization, because it's just you're putting them next to each other. You're not making a relationship between them. You're not anything other than an arbitrary relationship. You're not having a causal or hierarchical relationship between them.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So there's association, and then, but actually, now that I think about it, so I agree with that. Like, if I just associate banana with monkey, with jungle, with India, with hashish, like that's not that they're just associate. I don't know if that's generalized, say, from the particular to. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a generalization. I
If
agree
we're
with that.
generalizing, it would seem like you need to integrate in some way to state what the relationship is, not just to put them next to each other. But what about monkeys and jungles go together? Then maybe you could call that a generalization, say about habitats, or that there's something more general you're saying about monkeys. It's like, oh, monkeys live in jungles. I think that might be a way of calling that a generalization, but it's doing something more than just associating the concepts. You're doing something with it. You're integrating them somehow, stating the relationship or identifying the relationship beyond just the the correlation between the two.
Yeah, I can see that, but maybe only in the case of emotions then, because emotions are the general,
Perhaps.
right? Like if I um going back to that example we spoke about a while ago, where implicit in every action you can find some philosophical premise. Like, if I get angry, the example I used was my computer malfunctioned, so I smashed my mouse, not my mouth, smashed my mouse, and I'm implicitly acting on the premise of primacy of consciousness. Um,
Yeah, I could see that.
that
I mean,
then
you
like
need to
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah, but the emotion, let's say, is anger. But the anger can happen in that situation. It can happen when someone says something I don't like. So it's strange because the particulars are in that case triggering off the generalization of like universes. I don't know. It's a bit trickier, but I feel like that's closer to generalization then. It doesn't count when you're like banana to monkey to jungle, but if you're like banana or rain to sadness, like that's a form of generalization. But that's not necessarily a logical one.
Yeah, I think it could be true. I'm not sure, but it sounds reasonable. I would
Yeah.
need to reason that out, but it sounds like a real possibility. I mean, by
But
nature, it's still different than conceptual content, and maybe you could say some associations could be like generalizations or be components of generalizations even. It would be hard to say is exactly if is that just an association where you say there's an association plus an additional process with that, or would you call it something else? And I'm not sure I would call that association in the emotional context. Maybe I mean emotional connection, emotional association. Maybe there's a different concept we could use because it does seem different in kind than the conceptual association, say between monkey and banana. Say if you're associating monkey and anger, I think that might be different because emotions, are they mental content in the same way as a monkey is? I mean, like you can, anger is different than just monkey. You can have concepts of emotion, but you can also have the feeling of the emotion. So that's where it can be tricky. And maybe it would be a little different for
right.
emotions.
Right. I mean, I guess you could, the whole reason I brought this up, so I guess generalizing in respect to emotions or habits, because of some of what was written in Philosophy Who
Yeah.
Needs It, which I'm just pasting now. She talks about, let's see. Yeah, because she's saying that I'm just copying, pasting the relevant text here. She says that you don't have a choice, like you have no choice about integrating observations. And I assume she's referring to what we discussed here with like, we do automatically form associations of some kind. So like you can have a bad day and let's say it's raining and over time you build up the idea that rainy days make you feel sad and there's something bad about them. But that's not true. It's just it's that associative mechanism of the brain, which then forms this, we're not clear, but we'll go with emotional generalization. That was the motivation in that, because she was using the word, she was like, you have no choice about integrating. It's like your subconscious will integrate for you anyway. And what is integration but forming generalizations? But, like there's no, I don't form, there's no magic. I don't think of my subconscious as automatically integrating concepts. So she meant it differently, which is why I thought it may have been like this thing of emotions as generalizations or association as a kind of form of generalization. Like she says, your subconscious accumulates. Here we go. Unwarranted conclusions, false generalizations, undefined contradictions. So she's using that. She's using generalization differently than she would, or integration differently than she would when she's talking about concept formation. Like there is some difference. Anyway, that was the relationship to
I
this.
agree with that statement by Rand. The only thing is, I'm unsure if we would call that association, because it really depends how you define it. And I would say, yes, I agree that the subconscious can assemble things like that in not necessarily an explicit way like we do when we say monkeys eat bananas.
Right.
I mean, that's something more explicit. I think it could go on subconsciously in a way that you can integrate, say, what it is about monkeys and bananas that really just eat them because that's how you feed them in zoos, I think. Not that they actually eat them in the wild or whatever it might be.
I was thinking about this actually. I was thinking about something like, you don't just grab, because in this article, she's like, you say you're not interested in philosophy, but then why do you insist on using it? She gives all these examples like, it may be good in theory.
Yeah.
Doesn't work in practice. And, there's others. What else that she's got there? Like, I can't prove it, but I feel it's true. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
I can't prove it, but I feel it's true. And I was like, well, it's not like my brain takes that and suddenly creates a whole philosophy based on that. Like that, it's not like I hear snippets of philosophy and suddenly my brain just automatically starts a process of integration and identifying implications. Like, I don't think that happens. And so I thought, oh, okay, maybe she just means it's when she says generalizations, she's referring to association. For example, if I say it may be good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice, then in contexts where I have to apply some theory to reality, like that statement will come up. And just by memory and by use, it'll come up. And so that's a form of association, right? It's just the brain triggers, okay, in this context, I remember that I had this thought or used this idea and then it just sticks by association. And that's why I thought maybe she meant association as a form of generalization, because I'm not sure what you think on this, but I don't think the brain, the subconscious, actively finds the implications of these kind of statements.
Not actively,
and
not like that, no.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, there's some integrating process, but maybe it's very associative in nature. And when I think association, maybe I'm thinking a very psychologically, or the psychological definition as a special science, but see association as in you're putting two thoughts together Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a not as strong as a conceptual integration between two
Right,
ideas.
right.
But I think there is an integrating process which you could call associative, as in it's putting things together without that strong conceptual conscious integration aspect. Even that way, it would be fair to call association because it's non-conceptual or non-volitional in nature. It just some things just go together just
Yeah,
by their temporal
this,
similarity, they're being close together in time, and
yeah,
that's all your brain does. I think it's fine to call that associative, and I think any integration might be a type of association, but conceptual in nature that is a different kind.
right,
By not being volitional then, or being non-conscious, as in not consciously directed, then I guess we could call it associative, which does make use of whatever content's already in your head, but
yeah,
it represents your rational convictions and all that Rand said,
right.
but making an association. So I think that's a fair way to look at it.
So there are different kinds of integration. Like you could have a conceptual integration done according to essences of things, or you could have one that's an integration that's associative in nature. That is what we share with other animals, like man with stick, bad, or for us it might be,
Yeah.
there might be a certain food you eat. Like a classic example for me is you eat a certain kind of food and then you get food poisoning, and then from then on, no matter what, that food is like revolting to you. You would never want to eat that again.
Yeah.
That's a kind of integrative associative, but that's by chance. It's not. So there is
Yeah.
different kinds of they're integration, but it's different kinds of integration is being referred to.
Yeah. It's one of those cases where there might actually be better words for this. I mean, that's kind of what this categorical thinking can do. That makes you get precise on which word to use. Sometimes it's like, is it just a type of integration, or is association integration? Are they
Right.
distinct processes? Is association or is integration a type of association, or
Right.
are they separate things? That's
Okay.
the difficulty. But I think this is the right track that we're looking at. There's integration, there's association. Are there different ways to integrate? Is it always conscious, or is conscious integration just the most important kind? Conceptual integration versus associative integration, perhaps. There's a few
Yeah.
ways to state that.
So our brain is constantly integrating. It's an integrating machine. It's actively integrating, but the kind of integration depends on our volition. So we can, accumulate associative integrations, for lack of a better description, or we can integrate consciously, and the result will be dramatically different over, say, a few years. Basically, that's my understanding where it's at now.
Yeah, there's a bad way to integrate, there's a good way to integrate.
Right.
I guess Rand might say that's, or Peacock would say that's misintegration if you just let things go. But being integrated
Okay.
is more of a constant project that you're being aware of your integrations, not just letting the associative part take over most of the time, but being actively participating in your integration. It would be when you're a clearer thinker than others.
I I can make the case. We discussed this before, but that we're talking about how it's not really a generalization until it's. I associated generalization with always with concepts before, but in a sense, like an emotion is general because there's a evaluation. Let's say you're sad a lot. That
Yeah,
means I think you've lost a
yeah,
value or something, or you're angry. It means there's an injustice. And so, if you do come to uh, associate certain things, even if they're random and just pure chance, and associate like subconscious association, and they elicit emotions, like that's a kind of generalization, right? Because you that it's not a conceptual one, but it is. All of this is bad. That fits that category of bad. All of this is good. That fits that category of good. Isn't that a kind of generalization?
I would say it's a kind of generalization. I mean, it
Okay.
is a more general term than
Yeah.
anything, but yeah, I would call that a generalization.
Okay. All right. Well, then that's pretty clear because now I at first when I read this, I was like, well, I don't see my brain doing any conceptual integration. Like just because I say I don't feel it's true doesn't mean suddenly I'm walking around with a new philosophy and my subconscious has created all these new ways of acting. But I can see how you snatch onto those depending on your feeling, and then you start making it more familiar to you. So in similar situations, you'll start using those same slogans again. Or if you don't think much, then, like, let's say you go to a party and you have a bad time at a party, and then you're like, oh, all party, like, you start to draw these arbitrary sort of conclusions just by, or you don't draw them. Your associations are all there and mixed up, and then you can draw a really bad conclusion,
Yes.
which is automatic and default rather than through thinking.
Yeah, you can call it default because just what your brain did
Yeah.
relatively quickly without much reflection.
Okay, cool. That's this idea of descriptive, cognitive versus normative statements or concepts. Like, my understanding is that normative. So let's just go with one of them. So we'll start with concepts. I don't see why any concept can be normative. Like, all concepts are just concepts, and then you can apply a norm when you're using them. But I don't really get that whole distinction of cognitive, normative. Like, maybe statements I do, like, you should do X if you want. If you want Y, the norm is Y. Then why is there these distinctions between cognitive and normative concepts? And then this was in the essay about romanticism, by the way, with like, or psychoepistemology of art, I can't remember, but what's the need for the distinction between a cognitive and a normative concept, and an entire tree or branches of cognitive and normative concepts that are separate from each other?
What do you mean by cognitive concept? I don't remember that phrase.
Let me see if I can find it in the romantic. Where is it? Art? Romantic? What's the book again?
Romantic Manifesto.
Oh yeah, Romantic Manifesto.
Maybe essay was art and cognition. Could be the essay.
Too hierarchical. Yeah, here we go. I'll paste it. Okay. There we go.
Okay.
Two interrelated but different chains of abstraction, two hierarchical structures of concepts. That's what I was like, wow, I can't see how you can have, what is this two different, like, separated chains of abstraction? What is this normative? And I couldn't.
Let me read this carefully. The process of child is acquiring knowledge, true, which requires that is true. This involves the growth of two but different chains of structures of concepts, which should be integrated. Yeah, I never heard somebody use the word cognitive concept in that way, but maybe. But anyway, the first deals with knowledge of the facts of reality. Yeah, it's okay with what is the evaluation. What does it say? Well, I think it's because the first one, cognitive, is just to say that. Well, I like the word descriptive better, and descriptive being that they're just the facts of reality without saying they're good or bad or anything. It's just merely neutral. Saying, the sky is blue is a very neutral term. It's not trying to make a judgment, but it'd be evaluative or normative if you're trying to say blue skies are good. I mean, that you're just trying to make it to say you're evaluating something about the fact. It's like a second order kind of thing. Like it's judgments about the knowledge.
That I get.
Judgments about, yeah. And I don't think it's any different. It's developmental. I think she's saying you should integrate the difference between the two, that one leads to the other, that they're related. You can't have an evaluation without the facts, and the facts are kind of empty for the rest of your life, or for your life if they're not evaluative too. You need to have both aspects of thinking.
See, that I understand. So concepts refer to things, but they're all cognitive. But here it seems like she's saying there's two different structures of concepts which should be integrated. So like if I say this, the blue is beautiful, meaning it has value significance to me. That's an abstraction, a proposition that is normative. I can understand that. Good for me. My preferences are the norm or the standard. But in terms of an actual concept, I can't think of. I don't really know what would be a concept that would be normative, like an actual individual concept, and then why she's saying they're on two different structures, like they're different chains of abstraction. That I don't understand.
Well, bad would be a normative concept, or important, or ugly, or beautiful, because it's judging something. I mean, right. You seem to understand that already, but I don't think it's any more than that.
Oh, okay.
Those are, and you would think to categorize them differently than if they were facts. Yeah, they're related to facts, but they aren't necessarily a type of fact that you relate good and bad in a different way than you do, say, true or false. They're different. It's not that they're unrelated. That's what she's saying. They have to be integrated, but they have different hierarchies. That seems to be her claim. I'm not sure you could really say that they're two separate hierarchies. I'm not sure. It seems a bit odd to think that, but she is saying they're distinct structures or distinct ways of seeing, and they must be integrated for proper development of knowledge.
Okay.
You can't divorce the two. You can't tell good and bad without reference to the facts. You shouldn't divorce them from each other.
Right. So
it depends on the context of why is she saying this statement. It would seem like she's trying to give a reason why you need to integrate your thinking, and why art and morality still matter for somebody's life.
So a concept that has a norm implicitly built in, that is a normative concept. But a concept that doesn't have a norm, but is just a recognition of some fact, that's a cognitive. So like if bad is a kind of judgment according to some standard or norm, so that would be that's a normative. Important is a measurement of the value of something to a person. So the person and his particular values are the norm. So that's normative. Is that how it works? Basically, if the concept has a norm or standard built in, then it's normative. Is that?
Well, we could say color is a standard built in based on wavelength or hue.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But I would say that it has to do with goals or values. Either one of the two, that you can't have a good or bad unless you have a goal in mind. Like you could say frozen water is bad for fishing. Obviously that's a proposition, but that's the sort of thing you're thinking about, the badness of a lake, or badness of this lake for fishing. It's evaluating it for a goal in mind, not just really the fact it's ice or something. Ice isn't really a normative concept. It's not for a goal or anything. It's just, that's ice.
So, it's still something I want to think about. We can come to later, but I can sort of see that, I can see that the point is it's to get away from that duty-based principle of action, which we discussed, where you can act on if you habituate speaking to yourself in a way that's something like, I should do X without defining what exactly the reason for should doing X is, and there's no if that's made explicit. It's just a disconnected sense of,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
It'd be like saying, imagine it would be like if you treated the concept good like the concept blue. I mean, there's
Right.
just good, divorced of any goal or up. Purpose is
Right.
just the good is the good. It doesn't matter what
It's
you are
not
as an entity. It's
integrated.
just, yeah, it's not integrated with evaluation. In other
Yeah.
words, it's not an evaluation because good is whatever quality it is. There are some philosophers who explicitly have stated such things.
Right.
G.E.
Okay.
Moore is his name, is the main one who does that.
Does what?
Moore, M-O-R-E. He makes an argument that like the good is supposed to be detached completely from any, that they are just like facts of the world, like the color blue.
Isn't that based on Kant?
Probably. He's a moral intuitionist, is what he is, and usually takes these things as a fact. Probably
Okay.
derived from Kant, but but that's, I think, the early 1900s. I think he's from.
Yeah, okay.
But anyway.
Kant was what, late 18th century, so that could be.
1750.
But anyway, who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
1980s.
What else did I want to ask? I was in a tutorial today for the art of thinking.
Yep.
It was like a video conference, and I was pretty tired, so I'm trying to remember what was the question that I asked. My mind's blank, so we'll come back to it if I remember.
Yep.
Actually, I just remember now. So I didn't ask this question, but he gave the example, which was, if you find yourself constantly asking for examples and still not believing something, then that would mean that your concepts are floating, which often applies to me, in that if I ask a million questions, it could be an indication that my concepts are floating. And I found that interesting, because that's like an example of how you might identify a root cause for the way you think about things. And it could be some philosophical, you could be rationalist, not fully, but there's aspects of the way you think that are rationalist. And so when you're approaching something, you often need a million examples and you still don't believe it. And I found that interesting as an example of, it's from, the art of thinking. So it's using volition as a tool for learning, or the role of volition in.
It could be true. I mean, just that's what asking questions is for, to understand it better. If it's floating or whatever, it doesn't. It's like, of course, that's why you're asking questions.
Yeah, that's true. And anyway, let's go on. Okay, so fun with Miss Kvashnik.
Let me open this.
I went through the essay, some of it, I skimmed it, and there were just a couple of terms that I was curious about. I don't know if these terms are used differently in academia, but I wanted to go over the key terms she uses before I properly read through it and answer some of your questions, or ask you clarifications on your questions. So do you make any distinction between information and data?
I used to. No, I don't.
Right.
I was thinking about this recently, but no, not anymore, really. Sometimes people use it like data is like the particular information, the very particular stuff. The data that comes in before any evaluation, like voltage use or something. But information is more of in the literature, is often treated as a perspective on the data. That's a processing of data. That's what information is. That has to be processed or evaluated before it's information. Okay. So that's a common distinction in academia.
Got it. Okay. So academic context, data precedes information. Information is likely to refer to just processed data, cleaned up or whatever. Got it.
Yes.
And structure versus hierarchy?
Um, they're often very similar. It may not all structures are hierarchies, but all hierarchies are structures. And there's other kinds of structures besides hierarchies. Like a tree is considered different than a hierarchy
Right.
within data science.
Right. Okay.
That's all it is. A tree is more like maybe the tree of evolution, the tree of life, where everything there's the. Do you know what I'm referring to? Where you got the base of the tree itself is like the origin of life, and it branches out for the different species and how they develop. That'd be like a tree, but it's not really a hierarchy. That's kind of what I'm saying. Hierarchy is going top down, like we've been discussing. Like you could like there's animal, then there's monkey, things like that would be hierarchy.
Yep. Economic versus efficient, to me, they're basically the same thing, but
yeah, I don't see how it could be different.
So they're
Efficiency is being effective.
They're just sort of whimsically using whatever words that sound.
I had to go by context. If it's economic,
yeah,
I don't know if economic could just mean specifically
like economic word use, economic data compression. Yeah. Like to me, it's equivalent of efficient, but I don't know if that's the case. But that's why I asked.
It might. Some people might. That might vary. Actually, I'm not sure.
Okay. And then I do make a distinction between classification and concept formation.
Yes. I think,
but it often there are sometimes when they describe it, I think or at least I need to find the example, so maybe we'll skip it. But there was a point where I was like, it looks like she's basically referring to concept formation, and then other times she's not. But I would need to.
Yeah, I mean, classification in this context is usually looking at a context of things you already have organized or things you need to organize. Say you had, 20 vegetables to arrange in a supermarket. You have to classify them. It's not about concept formation, clearly, but they need to be classified for there. Or if you're a librarian too, this is for librarian studies. So it's like, you've got 30 books. How do you classify them? How do you arrange them? Which isn't necessarily the same as concepts, but it can follow similar principles.
I did write down something like organizing into groupings according to a standard determined by a chosen attribute, but that doesn't tell you, how someone chooses the attribute. They could choose it, by color. They could choose it by whatever their purpose is. Whereas a concept, isn't that in a way, that's almost broader than concept formation, because concept, you could say, well, I don't know if you're grouping actually with concepts. Like you pointed out, you've already got the things in front of you when you're classifying, right? But concepts are generalizing. Classification isn't necessarily generalizing.
It's not. Computers can classify. It has nothing to do with the concepts. It's usually like statistical or whatever you want to categorize by. Classification versus categorization. I think that really depends on the person. I think that could vary a lot.
Okay. So you've just got to read the whole article and infer based on their terms, because they'll often have terms they frequently use in these papers.
Yeah. But I think it's important to remember the context here of they're not necessarily classifying objects you've never seen before. It could be using things you already know conceptually. It's just you need to use it in, say, a library or a supermarket or a store.
Right. And then a scheme, when they use the word scheme, like to me, it's almost interchangeable for generalization, a theory, like a map of some kind, but it's not clear. Like, would you say I'm right in saying it's some kind of method of classification, or I don't know. It's much more vague than.
I would say a theory is a set of propositions that explain the causal nature of a set of entities. Like, it's more specific than just say balls roll. It's like saying there's a theory about why they roll. There's something about that.
Okay, so
the scheme is more of a structure of thinking. Like, say you could think about the metaphors, right? It could be schemes, or schemes could be like saying you have
Metaphor is a scheme?
maybe it could be scheme could be like how do you like a schematic being like a blueprint.
Yeah.
It's just how things fit together. Usually, like say, how do you might have a scheme for, this is within psychology, but it could apply anywhere. That like you say you have a scheme of how to treat people, and when you order food at a restaurant, there's certain patterns you follow, so of ordering food or paying for the food, and whatever it
Right.
might be, there's a certain scheme in mind of
Right.
how you'd go through that situation. It's not really a theory per se, but it's an organizing way to talk about how do you order food at a restaurant. And you have a scheme in your mind of how to perform that, how to get it together. It's not really a theory or generalizations. There's just a set of propositions maybe to within
It's
a
like a
specific
recipe.
context. Yeah, a recipe of how to
Okay.
put things together.
With this question that you said, what are some considerations of hierarchies besides genus and differentia, and why might these considerations be important? Do you mean what apart from a genus or differentia determines a conceptual hierarchy? Is that what you meant by the question? I did see all the other methods, but I was just trying to get the question.
Let me look at the essay. I know what I was referring to specifically when I look at it. Oh, I'll just tell you. Let's see. See, hierarchies mentioned species differentia, which is genus differentia. There's inclusiveness, inheritance, and transitivity. It's all
Yeah, they're properties. They're properties.
Yes.
But is that
Those
what you mean
bold
by a
parts.
consideration?
Yes, that's what I meant. Those bolded ones.
Okay.
They can be relevant sometimes when we're thinking about how do we categorize things.
Right. Okay.
Also,
All
necessary and sufficient was another good one. Like that's another way to categorize things. Like we were talking about versus like potential and capacity and whatever the other word was.
Condition.
Condition, yeah. That so when you think about necessary and sufficient, that can affect the way you organize those in a hierarchy. That's what I mean.
All right, let's come back to this later. I want to jump immediately to in the last remaining time. So I was thinking about free will. I was writing about at least what I know. Obviously, there's more material, but what I knew. So free will is the essence of it is the choice to focus, but you've also got a part of it. It's not everything, because there's also the choice to act, right? Like you can focus. Okay, I want to look at this or follow this thought, but then there is still a choice to act, which is that is determined by your focus, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then the choice, you have a choice to choose between, like your only choice is actually to choose between alternatives. Like for example, there's something in front of me and I choose to focus on it and observe it, or my subconscious throws something at me and I choose to focus on that and follow that thought and make it my purpose or the question. And so it's all about just the alternatives that you have, whether that's what's already in your subconscious, which is determined. So you're choosing between almost things that are determined, like what's in front of your perceptual field and then what's in your subconscious.
Yes. That would be, that makes sense.
And then, so on some level, your subconscious is determined. Like obviously your past choices would have affected your past choices in what to focus on would have affected the content of your subconscious. But at this point in time, when you're making a choice, the choice is between alternatives that are somewhat determined. I don't know if that distinction is useful, but
I think that's fair to say that the content available to you might be determined by your choice of which one to go with is undetermined or free to make a decision at that point.
Yeah.
I think that'd be fair to characterize, because you're not trying to say that literally anything is possible, because you can't just as you can't flap your arms or fly, there can't be literally anything you can think of.
Yeah, exactly.
what if they're
Okay.
constrained by those possibilities? But beyond that, I know I tend to disagree with a lot of people about this. Like, it gets really hairy when you talk about, well, what about the nature of the brain and things like that. I remember Lee Pearson.
Yeah.
I got in contact with him and we've had some number of conversations about free will. We actually disagree, but we've had some very interesting conversations. So I've been thinking a lot about this actually. But I
Right.
think that nature of thinking among alternatives is the key point there. It's not merely choosing out of nowhere, but choosing among the alternatives that you have before you.
And then choosing to act, meaning like
Yes. Yes.
do something with it
To
if you
act or to
choose.
move, to
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
And the what else did I want to ask you here? What do you think? The actual choice between alternatives, that is that just it's strange to think it's choice. Like there are different alternatives, and if you choose to weigh them, you can choose to weigh each choice according to whether or not it will lead you to flourishing. And so in a sense, there's no, you're choosing between alternatives, but if you use the standard of my life is flourishing, my standard for choice is what will lead me to the most flourishing, then there's in a sense there's like no choice but the choice to focus, right? Like you've
In
only
a
got one
sense.
path. I don't know if that actually works because you're still choosing your standard as what will lead me to the most flourishing. But if you do, then you only have like one thing to choose out of all the alternatives.
Yeah, it would seem though that still you have as long as there's an alternative and choice, it seems like that's the free will you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, mostly it would be about focusing where to direct that attention, that
Right.
control. I'm not sure to what extent, because a free will is more than focus. And I would think it's a little more than simply focus. But that, yeah, it would be so long range with like your life as you're flourishing, or the purpose of life is flourishing, that there's a huge amount of alternatives there. The difficult part is to distinguish in what way you're actually selecting alternatives. Like, when you're not necessarily always selecting where you're feeling moment to moment, of course, or moment to moment what concepts you'll in your stream of consciousness just pop up. That's not necessarily in your control. But
I
go ahead.
suppose um, that you can have lots of alternatives and it's not clear, like they're all good. And so you can choose in a way that it's almost, you've got say 5 alternatives for different careers you want to pursue. And then the choice you make is based on such small differences that it is almost just you've got 5 choices and they're optional. And it's not like you have that, what is it, Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, where if you always chose to focus and your standard was always life as flourishing is your standard, you wouldn't always have the same fate, ignoring the fact that, like different things can happen in the world. Just saying, if you had to replay a life and the person would always be in full focus and always choose the standard as flourishing, would his life play out in the exact same way? And so I think maybe if you've got a lot of alternatives that are just about the same, or you don't know, then it's optional in the sense that there's no eternal recurrence, even if you choose to focus fully and you choose life as your standard.
I literally wrote an essay on that topic exactly. Literally
Oh,
wrote using
really?
Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and
Oh,
exactly
that's
asking,
cool.
would, if there's among these options that seem almost indistinguishable, could you really ever say that you'd make the same decision eternally if you were
Right.
repeatedly in the same situation? So yeah, I've considered that. It's really hard to answer it. Other than it, yeah, the basic idea is the choice to focus, but going deeper than that, I would need to write it out a lot more because Well, especially if you want just the, I think there's even contention within objectivism exactly what is the nature of free will, other than
Right.
to say that we have it, and we agree that we can determine our destiny, but the way it's realized and the actual way we're free is kind of debated.